Good afternoon and welcome to the Epilepsy Foundation of Connecticut webinar, three-part series on transition, provided by the UCONN Center for Excellence in Developmental Disabilities. My name is Monica Anzalone and I will be moderating the webinar for today. And for purposes of sound quality, all participants have been put in listen-only mode. We welcome you, however, to use the chat icon, which is on the bottom of your screen, to type any questions, and we will answer those at the end of the presentation today. Our webinar today will be on the role of self-determination in transition, how it relates to self-advocacy, and what parents can do to facilitate this. I would now like to introduce our presenter, Dr. Nicholas Gelbar. Dr. Gelbar is an assistant professor at the University of Connecticut Health Center and also the research director for the UCONN Center for Excellence in Developmental Disabilities. His research focuses on improving secondary transition outcomes for individuals with disabilities, in particular individuals with autism spectrum disorder. He graduated with his Ph.D. in school psychology from the University of Connecticut, and Dr. Gelbar is a board-certified behavior analyst on the doctoral level, and also a nationally certified school psychologist and a licensed psychologist. So thank you, Dr. Gelbar.
Thank you, and thank you for that warm introduction. So as Monica said, today I'm going to talk about developing self-determination in transition age youth, particularly for youth with epilepsy. Before I get started with that, I just want to just briefly go over the UCED. So there is a University Center for Excellence in Developmental Disabilities in every state. Some states have more than one, and we're really focused on improving the lives of people with developmental disabilities through performing interdisciplinary training, community service dissemination, as well as conducting research, that's mostly what I do as the research director. As Monica said, this was part of a three-part series. The webinar that's going to be available on their website and our website, done by Linda Ramler, kind of gave the beginning opening that kind of looked at what transition is all about from both students with 504 plans and those with IEPs. And next week, my colleague, Dr. Craig Schramm, is going to talk about transitioning from pediatric to adult healthcare. We're going to make all these PowerPoints available as well as the videos of these sessions. The last thing before I begin is I want to thank Missy Wrigley from the State Education Resource Center. Her and I had developed a presentation that was previously, and she's let me use those slides. Our objective today is by the end of this session, you'll be able to define self-determination, state why it's important, identify important skills, and then also ways that you can facilitate self-determination at home and what you should be looking for from school-based programs. Epilepsy obviously ranges in terms of symptom presentation, the presence of other diagnoses, how much epilepsy impacts learning, and how much it's going to impact employment. So I'm going to generally talk about self-determination and sort of give a flavor of epilepsy, kind of knowing that any one child with epilepsy may or may not be in a certain situation. So we're going to try to keep this very broad. I'll be happy to answer any specific question at the end of the webinar. When we think about any skills, whether it's developing self-determination or career skills, we think about this independently.
Dr. Gelbar?
Yep.
I'm sorry, for some reason you're kind of fading in and out and there's like a lot of rustling.
Oh, okay, let me, how's that?
It sounds okay.
Okay. So we kind of think about, when we're teaching skills, can we teach a child to do this independently? Can we give a child an accommodation in order to access something? So putting something in place that sort of allows them to have access, so getting additional time to take tests, changing some of the curriculum or those things. And finally, we sort of think about some skills, maybe the child's maybe not going to be able to do it independently or with an accommodation, but can we find some type of support for them to do it? And I think this is where the range of all the individuals with epilepsy are going to fall, in that some of these self-determination skills, we're going to be able to teach children to do them independently. For others, we're going to have to kind of provide some support through accommodations. And for others, we're going to have to help them by providing kind of additional natural or contrived supports. And Craig is going to talk a lot more about this continuum when he talks about the skills that are necessary for the healthcare transition. One question is, well, why would we focus on self-determination? And if you think about it, this is a great quote from a colleague who I'm citing here, but if students floated in life jackets for 12 years, would they be expected to swim if we just said, no, we're not in the pool without the life jackets? And as Linda talked about last week, unfortunately, more often than not, that's the situation that happens when students leave high school, either by graduating or when they're 21, is they've sort of had all these supports and things in place, whether it was a 504 plan, whether it was an IEP, where the school had a lot of responsibility for providing things to children and their families. And after they leave, whether that's graduating high school or again, turning 21, a lot of the onus is on the individual. And, in post-secondary settings, if I want to receive accommodations from the college, while, they may be very, very similar to my 504 plan, I have to tell my college. Whereas when I was a high school student, my general ed teachers were required to do it. The onus now is on me to reach out to other people. And working on self-determination skills is the way to teach that, so that this individual, when they're navigating post-secondary education and employment, they can utilize those skills to be able to advocate for themselves, to be able to sort of figure out how to manage what's going on around them, and that they feel that they have more participation by doing so. Self-determination, it sort of sounds really complicated, and there are some really complicated definitions of it. This is from some of our colleagues in Kansas. And basically what this definition is saying is self-determination is you have the ability to choose your own goals. You are able to make choices that help you reach these goals, that you do that without any undue influence, and that by doing so, it improves your quality of life. Self-determination is also this ability to, if I'm going to do that, if I'm going to set my own goals, I have to understand my personal strengths and challenges. So if I'm a child with epilepsy or a youth with epilepsy, I need to understand, how is this impacting me? What accommodations am I getting? Am I going to need those accommodations in post-secondary education or employment? It also, again, it involves setting goals and making choices. And, we often think about teaching how to make choices. Well, we do that with young children, but a child leaving high school has many choices to make, including the types of post-secondary education. Do they want to go to be employed first before getting any education? So it's a really kind of complicated and nuanced process. The self-determined person is making independent decisions, and they're sort of working with others to do so. As my colleague Michael Waymeyer said, self-determination isn't about making a student independent. None of us is fully independent. Our goal is to help students make things happen in their lives. We're all interdependent. No person is growing all of their own food, making all of their own clothes. So we're inherently are in a community of other people, and developing self-determination is about helping individuals to navigate that community. Something I'm going to talk a lot about today in relation to self-determination is self-advocacy. And sometimes people confuse these two terms, but self-determination is sort of a bigger picture. Is this person able to feel that they can impact their life going forward? Self-advocacy is how they're able to do that. So that's speaking up and acting for yourself. It means taking charge and deciding what's best for you. It's being able to say, I have a disability, and I require these supports and services to do this job. One of my colleagues quoted a student who said, I began to attend IEP meetings in the 10th grade, but the teachers didn't ask me what I wanted. My dad asked me at home, and then he and my mom spoke for me in the meetings. At the end of 10th grade, my guidance counselor, Mrs. Sutter, asked me what courses I wanted to take next year, and I got to pick my classes. Some of the classes got changed in the IEP meeting, but they asked me first. I liked that. At the end of 11th grade, Mrs. Sutter asked me what classes I wanted to take in the 12th grade. I picked my classes, I get to take all of them, and I felt great. And this is sort of that example of, over time, the school was releasing responsibility to the student so that they had an awareness and that they could advocate for themselves. It's not about throwing them into the pool without the life jacket. It's about slowly building the skills. Even at first, in this example, the child just getting exposed to going to an IEP meeting or a 504 meeting. But by 12th grade, they're really helping to drive the process. So we talked about sort of self-determination, but sort of what is it? It involves largely 5 things, one of which is this ability to set goals and to figure out, what do I need to do to try to achieve this goal? Whether that's, I want to research colleges, or I want to have more friends, or things like that. It also involves this ability to make decisions, right? If I'm going to set a goal, in some ways I'm also not setting goals in other areas, and I need to figure out, what are the things that I want to do? Or when I'm faced with the homework and other demands of a high school environment, or at the post-secondary level, how do I choose what I'm going to work on? It's also important about decision-making, really thoughtfully thinking through decisions. As you're trying to achieve goals, it's also about, how do I solve problems as they arise? How do I work to overcome those barriers? And then finally, that self-advocacy piece of being able to sort of take charge of oneself. Underlying all of this, these skills really require a lot of self-awareness and self-knowledge. It requires that people are able to understand who they are and their strengths and weaknesses. So if you take nothing else out of this, one of the ways to help individuals be more self-determined is to have them understand whatever their disability is. So if it's epilepsy, it's, a child may know that they have epilepsy, but do they know how that impacts them in school? Do they understand that they're receiving specialized services at times? That they have accommodations and things, and that's done for them because of these issues? And then can they use that knowledge to make decisions as thinking about what types of careers do they want? What types of education do they want to pursue? And those things. I want you to think for a second, if you sort of think about this, but are you sort of more invested in goals you set for yourself or goals others set for you? So for example, am I more motivated when I decide to unload the dishwasher, or when my wife asks me to unload it? And I think clearly, like all people, we all tend to be more invested in goals we set for ourselves. And that's the same for children with disabilities. We're way more invested if we set the goals for ourselves, if we participate in the process. And if you think about the 504 and the IEP process, students aren't naturally involved in that process. It really isn't until high school that we start doing that, though we could work on that much sooner. And I think obviously this also applies to students with disabilities. Self-determination is really important because students with higher self-determination have better academic outcomes. They're more likely to be employed, more likely to live independently, and have a quality of life, including recreation and leisure skills. And they're just more satisfied with life. And it's really like you really start building self-determination very early. In some ways, kind of building self-determination is kind of common sense. And I think a lot of parents sort of naturally kind of gravitate to this because that's what they've been doing. Since their child was very young, they've been gradually releasing responsibility and giving their child more decision-making power over themselves. But it becomes even more crucial with disabilities, particularly at the secondary level. Again, it leads to better education outcomes, better employment outcomes, and again, better independent living outcomes. It also has been linked to having better study skills and ability to navigate post-secondary academic environments, as well as increased financial independence. Self-advocacy is this other piece that's been, it's sort of, how do I communicate that I have these these potential difficulties, and how can I tell other people about them in a way that I get what I need so that I can have a high quality of life. And it's really also finding that courage to ask for help. This is, and you can click on this link when this PowerPoint is on our website, but Allison Schwartz, a PhD student at Yale, kind of spends a lot of time in this article talking about how she was scared to ask her professors to ask for extra time, which is just a really simple thing of saying, hey, can I just, take the test in an environment where I can, if it's supposed to take me an hour, can I just, can I have it for an hour and a half, and because that would really help her to be successful. And she says, I have two big regrets in college: not asking for extra time sooner and letting the labels dictate how I perceive myself. And I think some of this is helping students to sort of take ownership of their disability so they understand that they can advocate and that it's to be helpful to them so that they can access what they need to learn in whatever setting that is, whether that's an employment or a college setting. Promoting self-advocacy means you have to be able to advocate on your own behalf, and it's sort of two parts. It's how to advocate and what to advocate. And I think particularly in high school, whatever planning meetings are happening, whether they're 504 meetings, whether they're IEP meetings, all children need to be able to do these things. When they leave, whether that's at 21 or grade 12, they should know how to advocate for themselves and what to advocate. So if a 12th grade student who's going to go to college next year, maybe, we want them to be able to ask their teachers for their accommodations, because that's what they're going to have to do in college. If they disclose to their college that they have a disability, their disability office is going to be, that's great. It's going to hand them a letter. They're going to have to take that letter and go to their professors and ask for that accommodation. Or if they're working, they're going to have to go to HR and ask for the appropriate accommodations. How to advocate, what does that involve? Well, that means that they should understand their rights and responsibilities and how those are going to change at the next level. It also sort of is important to teach students how to be assertive without being aggressive. So to sort of say, I have these needs, but to not be sort of overly aggressive about it. And then how to make sure that they communicate that effectively, which is inherently knowing where and when do I do this? Do I want to, some students particularly to be taught sort of, we need to not do this necessarily publicly. Maybe you should meet one-on-one with someone and work with them. You don't want to do that. And being able to sort of negotiate and compromise and persuade, because, that college student that I was referencing earlier, they're going to bring that letter to their professor. Their professor may say, no, for this test, I need you to take it in this setting. And they have to sort of be able to work that out. College professors aren't required to provide these accommodations the way that general education high school teachers are. Self-advocacy also involves listening and sort of being able to lead and work with others on a team to help develop self-advocacy skills. If you go to cpacinc.org, that's a Connecticut Parent Advocacy Center, they helped to create a book called Stepping Forward, a self-advocacy guide for middle and high school students. Chapter 2 just really goes into a lot of depth about learning how to self-advocate. More generally, like sort of, for the parents who kind of listening to this, I think one thing you're probably wondering is like, well, so a lot of that has to do with things that are going to happen at school. So what's the school's role and what's my role? So now we're going to sort of talk about this difference of sort of what's the school's role and now what's sort of like the parent's role and how can we work together for that. So schools need to be working with students to set their own transition goals. That's sort of, what am I going to do after high school? What types of careers am I interested in? What education do I need to receive? How am I going to live independently, if that's a concern, if learning the skills to live independently are a concern? We want students to be actively involved in their IEP and 504 meetings, understanding if they're receiving specialized instruction and related services, understanding the accommodations they receive and why, and understanding any other types of assistive technology or whatever else is going on that helps to facilitate their involvement in the regular education curriculum. Students should be really working on developing their own learning and by the time someone's in 12th grade, they really need to be managing their own time as much as possible. As much as teachers have this tendency maybe to try to do things for them or to say, you should work on this today and that tomorrow, they really need to be teaching students to develop those skills on their own, because that teacher is not going to be there when they're employed or when they're in college. Another thing that's really helpful is using person-centered planning. In Connecticut, we sort of have adopted a life course planning model that sort of looks at how do we develop people's strengths and abilities over time. And Linda talked a little bit about that in her presentation. And the most important thing is schools should really be reaching out and should be working with you to help students to develop these skills and to help families understand how to go about developing these skills, because it really needs to be a team effort in this approach. As a part of a lot of the work I do, I'm part of some committees that have worked together, and we've created something that's called the Connecticut Core Transition Skills. And these are 12 statements that talk about the skills that all children need to be able to do by the time they leave high school. And you'll notice that many of them are directly related to self-determination, including these first two, which are understanding a person's disability, their strengths, needs, preferences, and interests, as well as using self-determination skills. There are also ones related to self-advocacy. So if schools are wondering what they should be working on with a student, they should really look at the Connecticut Core Transition Skills and assess where the student is in each of these things. Have they assisted with the development of their individualized education program, for example? It's also important to understand that if we're building self-determination and we're allowing people to make choices and decisions and we're turning over this responsibility to them, we have to allow for a dignity of risk. And what that means is we have to be able to say it's okay for individuals to deal with the consequences of their decisions. Because in the adult world, we have to deal with the consequences. And it's better to learn that early and work on that and develop those skills. Because if we don't allow that risk, then we're not setting them up for failure. We're going to be throwing them in the deep end without that life jacket on, to use my earlier analogy. And again, individuals aren't always going to make the best choice. We want them to make a choice, see how that choice went, and if it didn't work or it didn't work as efficiently, then we can sort of give them feedback. And then giving them the opportunity to say, okay, you made one choice, it didn't work. Now could we try a different approach? If we sort of build these skills over time, children are going to know what they want, how to ask for it, how to set goals, how to evaluate, and also importantly, how to ask for assistance and how to advocate for themselves. As my colleague Carrie Sjogren is noting here, self-determination can't just be taught in schools, though. It has to also be taught at home. And if we think about it, a lot of parenting just really involves self-determination. We really need to think about self-determination as it applies to an individual's disability, as well as sort of the family environment going on around that individual. So some of the things at home is sort of helping students to understand the process, to understand that taking certain steps leads to different outcomes or goals. I think it's also really important for children to set both long-term and short-term goals and work on monitoring progress with them and sort of, and then keeping it simple and saying, here's how we can work on these things. And sort of, is there something you want to accomplish in the next year? Is there something you want to accomplish in the next quarter? Is there something you want to accomplish next week? Whether that's getting homework done, doing chores, any of those things, but really engaging children in goal setting early and often, I cannot understate how important that is. Decision making is also really important, and that includes, I think, being really conscious and working with children to, as they're making decisions, that, if you're going to make an informed decision, you got to find the information and resources, and you got to research and understand and use that information to narrow the field of possibilities. And I think providing opportunities for them to experience options, whether that's when you're making choices to buy things in a store, or when you're making family decisions about purchases or things, like getting children involved so they understand that there's a reasoning behind why decisions are made. And this point here, teaching situational assessment strategies, speaks more to schools, but that's sort of, we also should put children in situations where we ask them to make decisions. What courses do you want to take next year? What things, and see how they react, and see, do they know what information they need to make those decisions? And how can we help them to find it? Choice making is a little bit simpler because decision making is sort of a more open-ended process. Choice making is much more a close-ended process, where here are your options. You could do this or this. And I think what's really important here is to be consistent, to give different variety of options, to offer many opportunities. And then as children age, we start from very concrete and we move to very complex. Again, though, letting children kind of understand the consequences of their actions, as well as sort of another kind of piece of that is thinking about how do we teach problem-solving strategies. And that includes figuring out what problem exists, what are the barriers. You have a goal, you're not achieving it, what's stopping you from achieving it? And then helping them to create possible solutions or alternative ideas, and slowly having the child kind of direct more of that process, and then doing that reflection that I talked about earlier, which is saying, is this working or is it not working? And then getting them to think about, if I make this decision, what will be the outcome? And once they sort of think that, that'll help them to be better at doing this problem solving. To be really more direct in terms of just direct tips for parents, I think it's really important for parents to help children understand their disability, their strengths, their weaknesses, how whatever it is impacts them, because that'll help them to do everything we just talked about, whether that's choosing a career, choosing the education they want to approach, or any of those things. It's also really important to just keep documentation of everything that happens in terms of IEPs and other things, and really look carefully at your son or daughter's IEP goals and help them to understand the graduation requirements and why they need to take the courses they need to take in order to get a high school diploma. And they're not very common, but there are some options for children to not earn a high school diploma depending on the nature of their disability. That's kind of outside the scope of this, but if that applies to you, you should really research and think about what are the potential consequences if you choose not to take a high school diploma. One of the other things that I think is really important is parents can really help teach self-advocacy skills. So there are so many situations in which we have to advocate for ourselves, from appointments at medical doctors to going to the bank or other things. We're continually in situations where we have to advocate for ourselves. And I think if you can help children and provide them feedback on being assertive as opposed to being aggressive, helping them figure out how they can ask for help, assistance, and clarity, how to listen to people, how to think about perspective taking, and really to help them know what are their rights, how are their rights going to change in those pieces, and really providing everyday examples of how, sort of how we can agree to disagree and sort of move on. I think part of this is working with your child to think about what is their vision for their future? Sort of what would be success as an adult? What do they want to achieve? And as a part of that, how do they learn best? What supports are you already doing at home to promote success, and what works and what doesn't? And how do we help this child to be more self-determined? Meeting them where they are and moving them down the line a little bit. I think self-determination is something that it's not built in a day, a week, or a year. It's really sort of a lifelong process of learning how to be more self-determined. And thinking about, we do a lot of self-determined behavior in our homes already. How does your family make decisions? Who gets involved? How does your family set goals and who's involved? How does your child express their choices and goals? And what do you talk about in terms of goals for the future? Thinking about the types of roles your child plays at home. Have you had to advocate for your child? And is your child ready to start doing some of that advocacy for themselves? And how important is that to you? This slide is repeating for some reason. Another part of this is also, as students age, there are actually ways, especially for students who are special education students who are supported by an individualized education program, there are strategies where we can actually teach them the self-advocacy skills during an IEP, or what we call in Connecticut a PPT meeting, where we can have students participate there. And districts really vary in when they start having students get involved in their PPTs. The law requires it as soon as they turn 15, but they basically have to show up there. They don't have to participate. Some schools start very young, and just even if they have them come in for 5 minutes when they're in elementary school, and maybe they have them come in for 10 minutes in middle school, and then in high school, they're sort of more actively engaged. There's actually curriculum that's available, and I have a couple links that you could share with your child's school team that sort of are ways we can teach children to actually direct their own IEPs, where they say, here's what my long-term goals are, and here's how over the next year I'm going to be taking actions that help me to work towards those goals. I also have a bunch of resources that are available so that you could share them with, you can look over them yourselves or share them with teams within your district that you're working with your child. It's as well as some great books. And so that's my sort of big kind of overview of self-determination and how to promote it and how families can be involved in that process. And I wanted to make sure I left time for questions. So Monica, are there any questions from the audience?
So as we're waiting for people to perhaps type in some questions, if they have any, I just had like a quick question myself. And I mean, really, it's interesting because you think this is a mindset that needs to probably start right from day one of working with a child, where it's ongoing. And you talked about ways that might happen, whether it's in the home and how decisions are made in the home to kind of help that child to start thinking for themselves. And so I'm just wondering if you had any like additional comments for parents who, I mean, you know, even thinking with epilepsy, it's a spectrum disorder and the severity will be different from child to child. So for those families, let's say, that are dealing with a sick kid, that, you know, that where their illness is really just kind of taken over and they've not developed or established that mindset of transition. And so they kind of like, oh, you know, well, now they're graduating high school and they've kind of have missed that focus, that transition focus. I don't know what further advice, I mean, you already gave some in your presentation, but for those families that maybe have kind of missed some of this, that you're this pre-transition preparation.
Right, and I think it's never too late to start any of this. I think it is my first piece of advice, and I think that's one thing. I think the other piece of this is, so, you know, families, depending on how medically involved the child is, absolutely are going to vary in terms of how much they're able to also just adapt this mindset versus trying to manage day-to-day life. And I think some of this is just doing the best that we can to help build these skills, and that we can improve these skills. Not, you know, we want all people to be as self-determined as possible, but it looks different from individual to individual. And that every family and individual circumstance is different. So as we think about, especially with a spectrum type disorder, that, you know, some people are going to be preparing to go to college. Some people are going to be preparing to sort of, depending on the medical complexity, some other things. But how can we more involve this individual? Because the parents aren't going to be around forever. So we have to help this individual develop as many skills as they can. And as I opened with, there may be some pieces of this that they're going to need to have other support and services in terms of guardianship, healthcare decision-making, conservatorship types of things that we have to put other people in place to help facilitate this, because the parents aren't going to be doing this forever.
Right. Well, I think that's a really good way to end this, and just remembering that, yeah, each child is going to be so unique in the way that this is all going to play out for them. But very useful, very helpful information, I think. And I'm not seeing any questions. Now, Dr. Gelbar, can you send me that SurveyMonkey link? Because I don't know if people will be able to access that link until we get the recording up and going.
Yep. Yep. So I will send that to you to send
Okay.
to the participants. And again, anyone can feel free to contact me if they have any other questions.
What? What'd you say?
Oh, never mind. I didn't realize.
And does anyone else have any other questions?
No, I think we're good.
Excellent. So I will. I'll stop sharing the screen and we can end the thing. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yep. Bye bye.